What is Russia? Now, Russia and the West may disagree on many things, but one thing they have in common is in their presentation of Russia as a single, unitary, homogeneous state. There are many good reasons why both sides do this, but in reality, Russia is complex, diverse, and multi-ethnic. I'm Thomas Mitchell, and today I'm going to explore the debates about what being Russian actually means in the post-Soviet world and what Russia actually is. Let's start with the basic facts. Russia has 85 federal subjects, 22 of which are republics. 35 national languages are found among them, and over 100 minority languages. Overall, there are more than 185 different ethnic groups who share many different religions: Orthodox Christians, other Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, pagans, and atheists. And yet, the vast majority of these peoples, whose territory covers almost double that of the United States of America and is bigger than the dwarf planet Pluto, call themselves Russian. Why? And what does the Russian identity mean to them? Near the end of his seminal historical work, Russia and the Russians, Jeffrey Hosking discusses the crisis of identity that has been taking place in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union, and in many ways since the beginning of the Russian state itself. Is Russia an ethnic nation? A multi-ethnic nation? An empire? Hosking writes that there are broadly 5 ways in which the Russian nation might be defined today, and I will discuss and elaborate on each one in turn. The first is what Russia has been throughout most of its history: the creator and sustainer of a great multi-ethnic empire across northern Eurasia. Especially with the loss of the 5 Stan countries and the 3 countries of the Caucasus region, Russia is less a Eurasian empire than it was. But it undeniably still is, and because of the sparse population of Siberia and the lack of natural geographic boundaries, Russia will remain so. Most of these multi-ethnic peoples will describe themselves with 2 identities: as Russian but also Tatar, as Russian but also Kalmyk, as Russian but also Udmurt, for example. The second definition of Russia as a nation of the Eastern Slavic peoples complicates this somewhat. Firstly, because from the beginning the loose territories of Kiev and Rus were composed of multi-ethnic communities that included not only Slavs, but also Uralic and Finno-Ugric peoples, not only Christians but Muslims and many more pagans. So a nation of specifically Slavic peoples is both unrealistic and unstable. But secondly, and more directly important, imagining Russia as a nation of Eastern Slavs implies some kind of formal union between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Russia and Belarus have been in talks for the creation of a single union state for over 20 years. It is possible that one day Belarus could be incorporated within the Russian Federation as a new republic with varying degrees of autonomy. As for Ukraine, Kiev leans towards Europe, NATO, and is skeptical of Russia. The recent wars between Russia and Ukraine have encouraged that process, so Russia will no longer be able to become a nation of Eastern Slavic peoples by focusing only on voluntary support. With the failure of an Eastern Slavic union, this leaves the possibility of Russia as a multi-ethnic state with preferential status for ethnic Russians, indeed as a state where the interests of ethnic Russians abroad are protected, if necessary with military might. According to some estimates, there are still close to 30 million ethnic Russians and Russian speakers who associate themselves first and foremost with Russia, who remain outside the borders of the Russian Federation. With Ukraine, the issue has been particularly explosive, as ethnic Russians are the majority of the population in Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. They are also a majority in the breakaway state of Transnistria, internationally recognized as part of Moldova, but whose leaders regularly call for the Russian government to formally annex them to the Russian Federation. Latvia and Estonia too have large Russian-speaking populations. Latvia, a nation of 2.6 million people, constitutes only slightly over half the population with Latvians, followed by Russians at 36% and with sizable populations of Ukrainians and Belarusians too, while in Estonia, the East Slavic peoples make up 35% of the population. Altogether, there are around 1 million Russians remaining in the Baltic states, with almost 1 million having left since 1991, not exclusively to Russia, however. More recently, the Russian government has been encouraging ethnic Russians to return to the Russian Federation. As Russia seems to be gradually giving up on a union of East Slavic peoples, it is seeing itself as the homeland of ethnic Russians. This has the potential to alienate the millions of people who are not ethnically Russian, but identify themselves as Russian. Take, for example, the Buddhist-inspired Buryat people, who number 500,000, most of whom live within the vicinity of Ulan-Ude, not far from Mongolia, and who originate from the area around Lake Baikal. Would they and other Turkic peoples identify with a Russian state that sees itself only as the defender of ethnic Russians? The alternative to viewing Russia as the homeland for ethnic Russians is to instead view it as a community of Russian speakers, regardless of ethnic origin or current civil status. Since Russian speakers are so scattered, this would imply some concept of civic status independent of frontiers. But it is unlikely that the former Soviet states will accept the widespread use of the Russian language instead of their official national language. Russia's neighbours see how Russian has become an official language in the territories it has helped annex from Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The idea being that by speaking the Russian language, they too can become Russian. Russia's neighbours therefore consider the Russian language itself as reflecting Russian state influence, and they have introduced policies to marginalise it, which have further alienated ethnic Russians outside of Russia. Local citizenship laws have been introduced, and in some cases dual citizenship has been banned. Even if Russia could offer citizenship not only to ethnic Russians but also to all those who identify as Russian who were left outside of the Soviet Union upon its collapse, it would be difficult to carry out in practice, and would probably tend to prioritize ethnic Russians anyway, and not those who feel culturally Russian. Furthermore, although this is the Russia which resembles most its current form, it's not what many Russians understand as Russia. If Russia is unable to solve its geopolitical problems, it may begin to define itself as a truly federal republic, with citizenship independent of ethnic origin. The diverse republics of a future Russian Federation could be granted more autonomy, and each seen as the natural home of its particular ethnic group. This is what most nation-states were designed to be, after all. But many Russians, not exclusively ethnic Russians, see themselves as Russian first, and their particular ethnicity only second. Some want there to be legal protection for Russians abroad. Others want those Russians to return to the Russian Federation, and still others want them to be defended where they live, with the possibility of those areas where they live becoming future Russian territory. The irony of Russia is that the Eurasian regions which are historically least Russian, notably Siberia, are uncontroversially Russian territory, but the regions where the Kievan Rus state began, that is, the states of medieval Muscovy, contemporary Ukraine, Belarus and the Baltic states, those regions are powder kegs, waiting to explode. If the Russian state prioritizes the Russian ethnicity, it risks alienating its own minority ethnic peoples. If it prioritizes its multi-ethnic nature, it will be critiqued within for abandoning the ethnic Russians outside its border, and even if the state does nothing, ethnic Russians may rebel outside its borders, and nationalists may come to their support, with or even without the backing of the Russian government. The United States National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in 1994 that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine suborned and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire. But this is only true from the perspective of the West, who see Russia as a power that expands exclusively westwards. Russia's most successful empire, however, is to the east, and it is so successful that in this imperial periphery, Russia can most act like a nation. Brzezinski continued that Russia can be either an empire or a democracy, but it cannot be both. Paradoxically for the Western mind, though, the opposite might be true. Russia can be an ethnic-based nation of East Slavic peoples, but not a democracy. Or it can be a multi-ethnic empire within its own borders and a potential democracy. Overall then, what being Russian means is entirely up for grabs. Even 7 years after the Soviet Union fell, 52% of Russians polled said they had a close affinity to the notion of a Soviet people. A Soviet people. Russia's conception of itself has changed and will continue to change. How it is defined will determine whether Belarus becomes part of Russia, whether there are more wars in eastern Ukraine, and whether the Tatars and other ethnic minorities inside Russia decide they are not welcome and demand greater autonomy. It will determine whether ethnic Russians are legally superior within the Russian Federation, or whether all within the Federation are equal regardless of ethnic origin. Winston Churchill famously described Russia's actions as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Both Russia and the West seem to enjoy presenting Russia as uniquely mysterious as possible because of the incomprehensible nature of the Russian state or the Russian soul. Because of its size and multi-ethnic nature, Russia is different from the ethnic-based European nation-state. But Russia's actions follow logic. They can be understood. Although they are no longer homogeneous, the European nation-state was originally designed on that ethnic basis, and this model was exported around the world through empire. The Eurasian land empires worked under an altogether different logic. Eurasia's states are now trying to figure out how best to be a nation in the modern age. It's not only Russia, it's also China and Turkey and Iran. But when these countries try to be a nation on the ethnic-based nation-state model, they appear imperialistic. This explains the Russia contradiction. Where Russia wants to be a nation, it behaves like an empire, but where it is an empire, it behaves like a nation. Russia has always meant many things to its people. Though the Russian state and foreign media may present Russia as one homogeneous mass, as liberator or oppressor, it is neither. Russia is not inevitably destined to be either the villain or the hero. Its future will depend on what its rulers decide it means to be Russian. The Russians themselves, whoever they are, have more of a say in this than they or we think they do. And if you believe that being Russian is speaking Russian, is feeling part of Russian culture, well, if that applies to you, then you're entitled to think that maybe you're Russian too. Thank you everyone for watching. That was my first YouTube video, so it's all very rusty at this stage, but please leave your thoughts in the comments about what you think. And if you like this video and you want to see more in the future, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you soon.